Hello, friends, and welcome to Conversations with Consequences, where we are changing the culture one conversation at a time. We are the radio show and podcast of the Catholic Association. We address the issues that interest you, puzzle you, and flame you in the hope that we can bring some clarity, even to the darkest corners. You can listen to Conversations with Consequences on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network, Saturday mornings at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, or you can catch the encore at 5 p.m. We are also on Sirius XM channel 130. Of course, our radio show is always a podcast. Go to thecatholicAssociation.org/podcasts or directly to wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm your hostess, Dr. Grazie Christie. Thank you for coming back to Conversations with Consequences week after week. We hope we're giving you great conversations. I know that we have wonderful guests. Tragic news out of Turkey and Syria, news that gets more tragic every day. A devastating earthquake has claimed the lives of many thousands. We'll be talking later on in the show with Edward Clancy. He's Director of Outreach for the Aid to the Church in Need, for a deeper look at the situation on the ground there. But first, I'm your hostess, Dr. Grazie Christie, alongside my co-hostess, Ashley McGuire. Welcome to the show, Ashley.
It's always great to talk with you, Gracie.
It's great having a team talk, as we try to do ever so often. We should do them more often, actually. It's so much fun to talk to you. I hope that our listeners also find it fun and informative.
Yeah, no, it's always great to bounce ideas off with you and discuss. You know, there's such a richness of interesting articles and studies out there, and so it's great to discuss them with you, Gracie.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us from a Catholic perspective to have our ear to the ground, as it were, and paying attention to the different things that are happening in society and in the culture, and be able to talk about them and understand them, because they're affecting all of us. Very often I think we think that we're living in ways that are very deliberate and thought out, and that we're making a lot of decisions in a very specific way. But I think what's really happening a lot of the time, and I know it happens to me, is that I'm really just swimming in that same cultural fluid that everyone else, all the other fish in the world, are swimming in, and a lot of that's just happening to me too, even though I don't realize that. Does that ring true to you, Ashley?
Yeah, and I think it's important, to always be making a concerted effort every day to sort of read outside your comfort zone, for lack of better words, because I think it is easy to get insular in the way that we live and kind of close our minds off to, the really what's going on in the culture that we're very much living in. And it can be hard, especially when we're busy moms, to sit down and take the time to read sort of thought-provoking pieces and to spend time talking about them and thinking about them with others.
So here's an issue that's interesting to me and to you, I know, and I'm sure to our listeners, is the rise of spirituality in the culture as opposed to religiosity. So all of us know that the United States and the greater West is becoming less and less religious, right? Like organized religion is dropping adherents right and left, and Catholicism is unfortunately no outlier in this. People, instead of adhering to an organized religion like their parents did and their grandparents, what people are doing is they're being spiritual, because all of us need spirituality in our lives. It's a human necessity. We have to always we always have to be thinking of the transcendent and the greater spiritual meaning of our lives. We're just built like that. I think that's just in our DNA, and that's a wonderful thing that's there. But in the absence of an organized religion and a set of spiritually infused ethics and morals and a code, right, that our religion gives us, and a code to live by, and a list of things that we believe that make our existence understandable to ourselves and give us meaning. Instead of that, people are using vague spiritualities. New Age maybe is a term that we could use. New Age spiritualities. People are doing other things, like even hallucinogenics, in order to sort of open up that worldview and that open up that third eye maybe they have inside. People doing yoga, people believing that the universe somehow wants things for them. Like if they have optimistic thinking, the universe is going to return sort of like an optimism towards them, and is going to reward them somehow. Ross Douthat, who's a conservative writer at the New York Times, wrote a piece talking about this called, it was on February 1st, "Be open to spiritual experience, also be really careful." He took as his starting point, and I know you've seen this article, Ashley, he took as his starting point a sculpture that has just been installed in the New York State Supreme Court, the Appellate Division building. In Madison Avenue, and it's there alongside statues of people like Moses and Confucius, so people, lawgivers, right, associated with religions. And the statue is of this woman wearing like a lace collar, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She has these giant like afro kind of braids, but it also looks a little bit like a Medusa head, and she's standing. Oh, she has arms that look like the things you use to make a cake, right? What do you call those on your mixer, like mixer arms?
Oh yeah.
To make like batter.
Yeah.
You see, I'm not a big baker, so there's a name for those things. And she's standing on like this. She's like emerging from like a plant. So there's all these spiritual references of it's feminist, it's pantheistic, it's this statue. I mean, when I saw her arms and like this feminism, it made me think of like abortion instruments, but maybe that's just me being medical and pro-life. And her head is sort of like almost like demonic, because it's got these weird braids that make you think of Medusa or something really dark and evil. But it's meant to be some sort of spiritual exercise that's supposed to make you feel spiritually and connected to females. So Ross Douthat wrote about that and the dangers of opening yourself up, like the good parts of opening yourself up to spirituality, but also the dark parts. What did you think when you saw pictures of the statue, Ashley?
Well, I think, it's funny, all the headlines just straight up call it like demon statue.
Okay. I was being too kind or too subtle.
Well, no. What I read was that according to the artist, it was meant to show a fierce woman, quote, a form of resistance. Like it is very much has a brazen nature to it. But I think it's sort of sad that that's become what culturally we think of when we think of, strong women. And, back to your original point about how we're all kind of hardwired for religion, I think we do live in a sort of post-Christian society. And for Christianity, the woman that we idealize is Mary. And she's, there's been articles written about how Mary is the most recognized woman in the world. Her face, her statue and art, it's everywhere. But if you deny Christianity, it's in our nature to want to replace her with, and before Mary, there was this, in Greek and mythological cultures, it was the goddess. And so, but the sort of neo goddess is scary. But I do think that it's, you can't either deny Christianity or religion altogether, without seeing it replaced with something. Mm-hmm. And the beauty of Christianity is that something moors us to beauty and to goodness. But it is funny. It's true. It's everywhere. Like I go to Soul Cycle and my spinning class sometimes feels like they're trying to make it a spiritual experience. They use all these mantras. Mm-hmm. They use candles. Almost like it's its own kind of a mass. There's a ritual to it. There's literally like a litany, of, the types of songs and the type of exercise. And, thankfully, because I'm a Christian, I know that I'm not here for that. I'm there for the exercise. Right. But
they do try to tap into a spiritual component that is inside, that they feel, that the teacher feels is inside each of the participants in this spinning class, right? Which is very interesting. You don't see that in sports, for instance, but you do see it in exercise classes.
Yeah, and I've noticed in the culture of food too, that's been sort of infused with this weird, I mean, we call it virtue signaling, but this talk about food taking on a component of virtue. Like, I mean, literally there's a restaurant in DC that people like called Virtue Feed Grain, as
Oh,
if food can have a virtue. And you see this like wholesome goodness. I mean, go into a Whole Foods. Again, Whole Foods is another place where this sort of semi-spirituality thing is there. If you look around at the little, like artsy mantra things on the walls, they're very sort of spiritual in nature. And food is not spiritual. I mean, what's interesting is that, food.
wait, but food is spiritual, Ashley.
Right. But the food that we're buying at the grocery store
Right,
is
not your
not the
cereal.
food.
Your
The
cereal
food
isn't spiritual.
right. The food that we're going to mass, for the Eucharist, the bread of life is. And so it's so sad. It's like our culture has
Okay,
this.
but look what they're trying to do at Whole Foods, right? So there's this so God understands, right, that human beings are spiritual and material. So he reveals to us and then he gives himself to us in a way that is spiritual and material, right? So he gives us the Eucharist. And in Whole Foods, they're recognizing that same need. And they're giving us the spiritual and the material, right? But they're giving it to us with cereal and choosing honest, virtuous food, connecting our inner longings to what we're doing with our grocery cart and how we're spending, what used to be our $150 grocery bill is now $320, but at least we're feeling that we're feeding some spiritual necessity too, right? So they're tapping into that same space inside our souls, I guess.
Right. And what I appreciate about the Douthat article, and I'll read a quote. He said, start with the broad youthful impulse toward what you might call magical thinking, ranging from the vogue for astrology to the TikTok craze for manifesting desired outcomes in your life. In certain ways, this is an extension of the self-help spiritualities that have been attached to American religion since forever. But right now, the magical dimension is more explicit, the connection to old-time religion, weak to non-existent. And he goes farther to warn that there's a certain danger in sort of unmoored spirituality. And I think that's so true because things are either good or evil, they're right or wrong. And if you're sort of dabbling in spirituality, but it's not tied to the truth and the one true God, the demonic realm is there. I mean, we as Christians say a prayer to St. Michael the Archangel to defend us from the demons that prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. And so you have to be very careful when you get into that spiritual realm. And, another thing he talks about in the article that's so important is when you couple this sort of unmoored spirituality with drugs, which is, like in the city in Washington, D.C., where I just moved from to Maryland, they just legalized hallucinogenic drugs. And I think they've done that in Colorado, too, where I'm from. And so when you're doing like hallucinogenics, tapping into the spiritual realm, but without being tethered to, sort of Christian virtue, yikes. I mean, it's sort of like a Leviathan dimension that, it's scary out there.
And we do understand that there are forces out there, there's spiritual forces out there that are waiting for you to open the door to them. I see one branch of this that I see very often in Miami is something we have here called Santeria, which is it's a kind of cultish religion that grew up out of it's like voodoo, but it's from Cuba, and it combines some elements from African polytheistic African tradition or pantheistic, and then it attaches it to certain Catholic practices, and there's definitely an element of a terrible element of confusion there, of course, but also an element of opening yourself up to spiritual forces that are not under your control, that can easily invade you and take possession of parts of you that don't belong to those forces, right? To the dark forces that do exist out there, And I'll give you an example. I have a friend who was dabbling in Santeria, and this is maybe 3 years ago. And she suddenly realized what she was doing. She was sort of drawn into it by a friend at work. And she said, "What do I do?" And I said, "Well, let me go ask at the Ermita, which is the shrine to Our Lady of Charity, who's the patroness of Cuba, which is near my house." And I went and I asked, and this is a place which is very devoted to people from Cuba. It's always full of Cubans and coming to worship Our Lady of Charity. But they know a lot about Santeria because the Santeros come there a lot too, because they also have an attachment to Our Lady, which is in a very strange and devious way, but they're attached to her. So I went and asked. I said, "My friend has been dabbling in Santeria and she needs some kind of exorcism." And she said, "Oh, well, Father so-and-so, his waiting list is 6 months long to meet with these people who have been dabbling and feel that they've been touching dangerous things and open themselves up to dangerous things." So that's a very Miami version of something which many people are experiencing by allowing themselves to get untethered from religion, from a way that's logical and orderly and beautiful, to look at the transcendent and the metaphysical realities of our lives, and instead letting themselves sort of flow in these dark currents.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that, as Christians, we're forbidden from, dabbling with things like palm readers, tarot cards. I mean, it's a grave sin, and that is because that dimension of evil. We live in a culture that's so, I don't know what the right word is. It's funny, we want to believe in happy clappy, the good stuff, but not, the good spirituality, while denying sort of the bad spirituality. But it's very much still there, and we're in a constant threat of it. And, the Bible is explicit about, wearing spiritual armor and armoring yourself for spiritual battle. And so I was thinking, about this Douthat article and how it's almost like we've gone through different stages of post-Christianity. And there was a period where it was sort of, more outright denial of this, like, oh, the science is king and this flies in the face of science, and any kind of spirituality is silly. And now we're swinging. And again, I think it's because, to go back to what you said in the beginning about the fact that the truth is we're hardwired for spirituality, and you can't suppress that. It will find a channel or an outlet to this revival of this neo-spirituality. And, he has another good line. He says that there's reason to worry about a society where structures have broken down and a mass of people are going searching without maps, or playing around in half belief, or deploying against what remains of Christianity symbols that invoke multiple spiritualities at once. And so, the devil will take advantage
of our mapless state, right? So we have no map in our culture right now to look for God, for the transcendent, for the metaphysical.
And what I thought of too was back right after the Dobbs decision, that group of really sort of radical abortion activists who were going around threatening, like Knights of Rage. They called themselves Ruth Sent Us. And I just remember thinking at the time, be careful, because you're basically summoning the dead. And, that's like Ouija boards, level stuff, saying that, somebody who's dead has sent you to do work. I mean, we believe that somebody who's risen from the dead and, lives in eternal glory has dispatched to us. But it just, that I just think that was kind of a good example of how, if the devil's agenda is evil and abortion is evil, that's dabbling in this weird sort of pseudo spirituality that we're talking about.
Douthat makes a really good point that what's going on is that people are reacting against our Christian past, and they are saying that, well, the reason there's prohibitions against things like Ouija boards and the occult and hallucinogenic opening up to your, to the spiritual realm, is because that's a kind of patriarchal white male chauvinism, right? So, the church, the Catholic Christianity never wanted you to look outside of the fold. They wanted you in their little pasture, right? And they're just trying to control you. But then he makes the point that there's a presumption that the pantheistic or polytheistic traditions are automatically going to generate some humane and kindly society. And that's simply not true. Like, you can't look out into world history and cultural history and say, oh, if we were, like the noble savages and pantheistic and polytheistic and open to all these spiritual ideas without any rules or any kind of, understanding of the God as as one person, that we would suddenly live in a better society. On the contrary, we would be like the Aztecs or that ate their children, or, and all these terrible societies where human sacrifice was practiced.
It's so true. And I've been listening to this wonderful podcast that I recommend for parents with young children. It's done by, I think it's called Shining Light Dolls. They do those cute little saint dolls. And it's got hundreds of little 10-minute episodes about saint stories for kids. And this one that really captured the imagination of my kids, I'm embarrassed to say I forget the name of the saint. Probably a lot of listeners will know who I'm talking about. Was a monk and lived at a time when in the, town that he lived, there was this monster. It was, some kind of animal that's now extinct that they called the gargouille. And it lived outside town, and people thought that the way to appease it was to regularly basically present it with a townsperson to eat alive.
Okay, but this is a basic human instinct, right? It's been part of every culture for as long as we have existed.
Right. But what's so fascinating is that this monk heard the cries of somebody who was going to be sacrificed to this monster, and went out and said, no, you don't appease evil by feeding it. You appease evil by fighting it. And so he killed this animal by invoking God. And that's why they put the head of this gargouille on a stake. And it was later that a French architect saw that and decided to incorporate what we now call gargoyles onto cathedrals, because it was sort of embodied and symbolized the triumph of good over evil. But you're right that like these sort of pagan cultures were monstrous, where there's a philosopher who writes that basically in every culture there's an element of human sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And look at our culture. I mean, thousands and thousands of years later, and human sacrifice is still woven into the fabric of what we define as, empowerment for women. But, mm-hmm. It's Christianity that, triumphs over that sort of barbarism.
Well, and how interesting that in Christianity, God wanted for us to sort of appease that need for sacrifice, but turned it into his own sacrifice of himself, and then invited us to the sacrifice of the Mass every single day, right? It's almost, he was saying, okay, I know you've got this dark need, because we sin. Like, the dark need comes from the fact that we are sinful, that we know we've done wrong, that something has to be done to atone for it, that we know our brokenness, we know it exists, we feel it in ourselves, we're disappointed in ourselves every day. And then he says, wait, but I'll be the sacrifice. Don't sacrifice your children. Don't feed the monsters of life, don't feed the monsters of human brokenness with the flesh of your children. Feed them with my beautiful body, so that I can cure them and solve it for you and carry away that pain and that sin. But you make such a good point, Ashley. It's human sacrifice, I guess, is much more prevalent now than it was before Christianity sought to make away with it because of the terrible prevalence of abortion. What a sad reflection. And then is it any surprise then that young people who've been brought up in a post-Roe age where abortion was completely legal, where human sacrifice was just the price we paid for sexual liberation, is it any surprise that they open their doors to these dark forces they're more open to it?
No, and I think that it's just our conversation is such a reminder of why the beauty of Christianity and the fact that it incorporates so many aspects of human nature, but elevates them and synthesizes them in a logical and understanding way. Whereas, without that, it's all very disorienting. And that, I think, would be the most terrifying, more terrifying than not believing in God or any kind of divine purpose would be opening up to a spiritual dimension with that mindset would be utterly terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Douthat at the end of his article says, the future of humanity depends on people opening doors to the transcendent rather than sealing themselves into materialism and despair. And oh wow, that's so incredibly true, right? Because if we don't open ourselves to the true meaning of our lives, right, as created beings, children of God, with certain duties and responsibilities, and also certain possibility of living an eternity in fellowship with God, then we're sunk into materialism and despair. And yet it's a door that has to be opened very carefully, as he says.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Ashley, for joining me today on Conversations, and thank you to our listeners for joining us as well.
Thanks, Gracie.
Friends, and welcome to Conversations with Consequences, where we are changing the culture one conversation at a time. We are the radio show and podcast of the Catholic Association. We address the issues that interest you, puzzle you, inflame you, in the hope that we can bring some clarity, even to the darkest corners. You can listen to Conversations with Consequences on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network, Saturday mornings at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, or you can catch the encore at 5 p.m. We are also on Sirius XM channel 130. Of course, our radio show is always a podcast. Go to thecatholicAssociation.org/podcasts or directly to wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm your hostess, Dr. Grazie Christie, and I want to thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Consequences. We love our listeners. We love to have you. We hope that these conversations have consequences for you, wonderful consequences that make you grow and make you happy and inspire you. Now we focus on the tragic news out of Turkey and Syria, news that gets more tragic every day. A devastating earthquake has claimed the lives of many thousands. Now we turn to Edward Clancy. He's Director of Outreach for the Aid to the Church in Need, for a deeper look at the situation on the ground there. Welcome to the show, Edward.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Edward, it's almost unimaginable what's going on in Turkey and Syria with this terrible earthquake, but it's only the first it's only the last in a series of great tragedies that have taken place in this region.
That is absolutely correct. If we look back to recent history, within the last decade, a little bit over a decade, it was started with the Civil War. And for the Christian communities, the Civil War isolated them. And then when there was sanctions against Assad, they were, in a sense, very severely compromised because they were not able to do the normal things that would keep them going. So that would be the second thing that happened. And then you have, of course, the rise of ISIS, and then the sequestering or taking of certain territory, and Christians were forced to flee. And then you go to a few years ago with the tragedy in Lebanon, and now Lebanon and Syria are so directly linked in so many ways, both in communities and also financial situation. Lebanon has always been used as a way of getting help into Syria during this time. But then there was the collapse of the Lebanese economy, and there was also, the explosions at the port, which devastated the Christian community. And then now, after all of these things, we have the earthquake. So when we look at it from say 30,000 feet or so, we can see that not only do you have a community that's been devastated many times over, you also have a diaspora community. You do have people in Syria who've relocated from other places where they thought it was more dangerous, and now are going to be going through, again, either another relocation and or suffering great loss in life and property. So it's a very difficult time for the people of Syria, and in particular the Christian community there.
What about Turkey? How do you see the situation in Turkey in relation to the Christian peoples there?
Well, if we look at Turkey, Turkey is a study in what we don't want to happen to the church in the Middle East. If you go to the readings in the Gospels and the New Testament, you'll see a lot of the areas of Turkey were very Christian. In fact, a century ago, the Christian population in Turkey would have been about a quarter or a third. Now it's under 2%, maybe even under 1%.
Oh, that's amazing. I had no idea that had been such a steep decline so quickly.
Yes, well, part of it is because of what happened. A large part of those communities were Armenian. And so during the Armenian genocide, they were either driven out or died.
Yes.
And then, of course, you had the Syriac and Assyrian Christians who also were in the region, who died alongside the Armenians or, like them, were forced out. And obviously, like what happened with ISIS, when armies or armed militants come into your region and they're targeting Christians, people leave.
Of course.
So that is what happened historically in Turkey. So the church in Turkey is very small. Now, Turkey was affected in a greater way than Syria because the epicenters seem to be right within their borders. So there is going to be a greater loss of life and damage. But for us as a Catholic organization and working through the international Catholic community, there's little capacity there to help other than in a small way. Because if we try, the community would be overwhelmed. The numbers of people, both the fact that they would be affected and then to try to get aid through them would be very difficult. Whereas in Syria, it's a little bit different. Syria, for us, you have a large Christian community. And in fact, there has been a steep decline in population, that at least a third of the population, Christian population, is gone. It could be more since the rise of, we would say the rise of ISIS, but maybe if you go back to the beginning of, say, even the incursions, the wars in Iraq, et cetera, that have seemingly affected the Christian communities in a much greater way, because when there was armed combatants in the region, it always seems that the Christians are in the middle of things. It's both good and bad because they are communicators, but they are also, unfortunately, in the way of what some groups might want, and that causes a lot of problems.
And in Syria, there are several towns which were affected by the earthquake with significant Christian populations, correct? That's towns like Aleppo
correct.
And Homs and Latakia, if I am pronouncing those correctly.
Yes. So it seems, again, we have a representative literally on site as we speak, visiting some of the different places. So Latakia, Homs, not so much so, Hama, more so, and Aleppo. Now, Aleppo, for historical purposes, was on the Silk Road. It was a major trading port. And in fact, for much of Syria's existence, Aleppo was even more important than Damascus because of its connection with the outside world. It would be like New York compared to Washington, D.C. in a sense. And so Aleppo has always been a center of cultural exchange, a center of commerce, and a true center of Christianity. And so in Aleppo, back when ISIS was attacking and there were all sorts of these problems back in 2015, we had Archbishop Jean Bart, the Melkite Archbishop of Aleppo, visiting with us for the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, and also to talk about what's going on in Syria at the time to the Christian community. And while he was here, his cathedral was attacked, and literally, you could see him talking on the phone to people in Syria as the attacks were happening. And during one of those attacks, Father Dehar, who just passed away in the earthquake, was wounded, and in fact, because of shrapnel, lost sight of one eye. So when I heard of his passing, even though I've never met him, I had a connection, a sense that, I remember him.
Yes,
I remember who he is. And you have this sort of remember praying for him that Archbishop Jean Bart had, during conversations and gatherings that we organized, had asked people to pray for a priest, as he put it, a priest of his diocese who was injured. And unfortunately, he did not survive. The Archbishop Jean Bart did, although, he is, I believe he's just around 80 years old, and of course suffered through an earthquake. So, we always have to wonder that pray for him, essentially, just because, he's older and he's a strong mind and will. But obviously, when things like this happen, it can be very detrimental to his health.
Well, even if he escaped unscathed physically, I'm sure the horror of so much suffering and death around him and affecting his community is a terrible spiritual burden on him and psychological. So we'll definitely pray for him. Edward, tell us about Aid to the Church in Need. Tell us about your organization.
Sure. Well, in a way, we were born of a situation of displaced population back in the late 1940s after World War II. And at that time, there was a German community or German communities that were pushed back into Germany from other countries outside of Germany. And because of their displacement, it caused them to be in severe financial problems. So we responded to Pope Pius's call to help these communities in Germany, and that was the beginning of our organization. And later, when we started helping mainly priests who were seeking to, people vocation support, so seminarians, because during World War II, many vocations were delayed or ended. So we helped that, and then we started helping all across the world in places where Christians were persecuted or suffering. So it started in Eastern Europe, and then it expanded out into Africa, Asia, et cetera. And now we work in over 100 countries each year. And we support about $150 to $160 million in projects, all based on small donations. We don't receive any, internationally this is, we don't receive any direct support from any government agency or, these large corporations, because we base our efforts on providence and on teachings of the church. So it makes it difficult sometimes. And so we have a long history in Syria that was, modest, if you look back 25 years ago, supporting vocations and minor projects. And then since 2010, it has expanded in Syria greatly. Since 2011, I believe we've sent in about $55 million, maybe $60 million in aid, all sorts of different programs supporting Christian communities, supporting the vocations, and supporting medical and schooling projects for the community as they were affected by the things I talked about before, the attacks of ISIS, the civil war, economic collapses, and now the latest earthquake problems. So we have a great connection to the church there and a constant communication. So it helps us greatly when something like this happens, because we get to respond by listening to the people literally on the ground who are firsthand taking care of the people.
And now, in the face of this terrible tragedy in Syria, what is the church? What is Aid to the Church in Need doing physically? What's your material help at this time?
Well, initially we started with accepting or talking to some of our partners on the ground about projects of supporting food distribution, blankets, milk, baby formula, and things like that. And we will do that. But we realized very quickly that there are a lot of aid organizations that are moving to do that immediately. Mm-hmm. But what we've seen now, as we saw in Iraq, and we have a sort of a plan of action that we can build from there, that the Christian communities will be very affected by the loss of housing. And this is an opportunity for the loss of the Christian community, because they will seek other places to go to live safely. And if it's outside Syria, we could see a great loss of the Christian community there, and that would be a tragedy. So what we will do is we will respond through the local church to help Christians relocate or rebuild their homes within Syria. So there will be an effort to engage engineers, as I mentioned. We have an experience with this back in Iraq during the bloody trails of ISIS. After that was over, Christian communities in the Nineveh Plains had to be rebuilt, and Aid to the Church in Need was on the front lines of that. We helped to organize the Nineveh Plains Rehabilitation and Rebuilding Project, which brought together experts in the fields from the region as well as different faith communities in the Christian church to rebuild these 7 or 8 towns that were devastated by ISIS and the attacks. So we will use that experience and what we learned from there to do something similar now in Syria, and that we will put together the people that are needed to help these Christian families to see if their homes are safe, to help them stabilize and repair, and help them get back in place. And then there might very well be an opportunity for us to do small sort of micro projects to help them rebuild their lives, re-support, because there is the possibility that if you had a certain life before the earthquake, that life may not be available to you to go back to after. You may have to retrain or refocus what you do. So we would like to help the Christian community in those opportunities.
Edward, in your view, why should the Christian community stay in Syria? Why is it important that Christianity keep its presence there? Because I know I'm sure people listen to you and they say, well, this is just not a place for Christians to live, possibly.
Yeah, well, I would say that, what we learn from Jesus is that we will always be persecuted. Mm-hmm. And so just that fact alone means that we're going to be in a world where there's going to be persecution. Not that we should seek it out. But what's important about Christian communities is wherever there is a Christian presence, there is more peaceful existence. We've seen that in places like Iraq. We've seen that in places like Lebanon. I think Lebanon, you can go to a place like Tripoli where the community of Christians is like 2%. And yet they live peacefully among the Muslims. And one of the reasons there is because they're trusted. They are the experts. They are the peacemakers. They are the teachers. They are the professionals. They oftentimes are the people that taught a lot of the upper echelon of the people in Tripoli in their schools. So you see that not only do we serve a purpose, for the functioning of a society, but that the presence is important. The other thing is that this is where the church was founded. I mean, you cannot read the gospel and not be touched by some story that connects itself to the region. And in fact, Syria is credited for being the place where Christians were first called Christians. So just on that historical basis alone, you would say that's not something we should just look past and say it's history or a museum fact. The other thing is that these people want to stay. It is not that they are looking to leave, at the drop of a hat. No, they're forced to leave. Mm-hmm. So the goal for us is always going to be to help them to stay if it's possible. And I think it is possible, and I think it's very good. And the next thing would be to help them, give them the footing so that they can not only stay, but they can, in a sense, thrive. And to the church need, that's an important objective and goal.
And Edward, how can our listeners help Aid to the Church in Need in this moment and also in your other endeavors all across the world?
So if you visit us at churchinneed.org, you will see that we will have regular updates on the news. As I mentioned, we have somebody literally in the region. We're in constant communication with the different faith communities. And that goes across the board from, the Catholic Church as well as the Orthodox Church and some of the Protestant denominations, because of the respect that Aid to the Church in Need has had working in places like Syria, and then many years inside behind the Iron Curtain where we were working with all Christians. So churchinneed.org is a good place for understanding what's going on, a good place to hear the Christian voices that are in the region. And of course, if you are called to give, please help the Christians in Syria and other places. I mean, there are many, many other communities we could talk about, whether it's Ukraine or Nigeria or, so many more that really need our prayer support and our financial support.
Well, thank you so much, Edward Clancy, Director of Outreach for the Aid to the Church in Need, for giving us a deeper look at what's going on in Turkey and Syria and how it impacts terribly our Christian brothers and sisters. And we will pray for your good work. And please, listeners, go to the website and learn more. And perhaps you can contribute also to aid to the church in need. Every morning, the Catholic Association reviews all the latest news and sends our subscribers a carefully curated collection of the most important news of the day. Items are specifically selected for a smart Catholic audience like you. Don't let the world take you by surprise. Subscribe to our daily media roundup at thecatholicAssociation.org. And now, Father Roger Landry offers us, as is customary, a short and inspiring homily to prepare us for this Sunday's Gospel.
This is Father Roger Landry, and it's a joy to have a chance to ponder with you the consequential conversation the risen Lord Jesus wants to have with each of us this Sunday, when we will enter more deeply into one of the most important dialogues that's ever taken place. Every 3 years, we have the chance to ponder at Sunday Mass Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. We begin with the Beatitudes, which we considered 2 weeks ago. Then last week, we pondered our identity as salt of the earth and light of the world. This Sunday, we get into the heart of the Sermon on the Mount, which Jesus calls us to live by a special set of Christian standards, a higher set of principles than the norms of the good pagans who love those who love them, and higher than the standards even of the Jews most rigidly observant to the Mosaic law. Unless our holiness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, Jesus stresses, we will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So the stakes can't be higher, and what he's going to tell us is too important to ignore. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus sets out 7 different ways that as his disciples, our holiness is supposed to surpass others. He gives us 5 this Sunday and the final 2 next week. These marks of Christian behavior go beyond merely keeping the natural law of the 10 Commandments. They're meant to transform our heart and our whole life from the inside out. They challenge us not just to be good, but genuinely holy and Christ-like. All are challenging. But we need to remember that by calling us to these high standards of ordinary Christian living, Jesus is showing us an exhilarating confidence that we, together with his help, can live up to them. The first standard Jesus teaches us this Sunday involves the whole way we treat others. He says it's not enough for us not to murder someone. We need to refrain also from the thoughts that set us on the path to maim and murder our brothers. Jesus tells us, if you're angry with a brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. If you insult a brother and sister, you'll be liable to the council. If you say, you fool, you'll be liable to the hell of fire. We're called, in short, to love others from the heart and head outward. We don't love others if all we do is not kill them. If we're envious, jealous, uncomplimentary, or vengeful within, we're still not loving them. To enter into Jesus' kingdom, to become holy, we can't kill with our hearts or tongues either. The first standard to which Jesus calls us is to love our neighbor like Christ loves us. The second standard to which Jesus calls us is to make the first move in reconciling ourselves with those from whom we have been alienated, either by our sins or their sins. When you're offering your gift at the altar, Jesus tells us, if you remember that your brother or your sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled with your brother and sister, and then come and offer your gift. Jesus is saying to us that it's not sufficient for us to be merely good with God. We also have to be good with others. When we come to pray and ask God's forgiveness, we must examine first whether others have something against us. If they do, Jesus tells us that we need to make the first move to go and reconcile, even if we've been the one aggrieved, just like God made the first move in reconciling us when we had sinned against him. So the second standard is to be reconciling, just like Christ came into the world mercifully to reconcile all things to his Father. The third standard to which Jesus calls us is truly to be pure of heart. It's not enough for us not to commit adultery in the flesh, he says. We need to avoid the thoughts that lead to adultery. Jesus states, I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus implies that even sacramentally married spouses can be adulterers with each other if they allow lust for each other to invade their marriage. But this standard of purity applies to everyone. Those who use pornography or give in to lustful thoughts become serial adulterers in the heart. Lust, as St. John Paul II taught, changes the entire intentionality of a human person from a giver to a taker, from a protector to a predator, from someone who sacrifices his own desires for another's good, to someone who consumes another for his or her own gratification. Jesus wants us, rather, to become truly pure of heart, and through prayer, self-discipline, the sacrament of confession, and other graces, he will help us. The third standard is to be pure of heart and see and reverence God and others rather than try to use them. The fourth standard is about the indissolubility of marriage. Jesus says, anyone who divorces his wife causes her to commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Later on, Jesus explains why. Because in marriage, God joins a man and a woman for the rest of their life in one flesh. What God has joined, even all the family court judges in the world can divide. Some may tragically need, for legal reasons, to seek a divorce, to protect themselves or their children from an abusive spouse or one who's behaving in such a way, like foolishly wasting joint resources, that the future of the children is put at risk. But that civil action of divorce doesn't break the one flesh union created by God, which lasts until death. It's easy for us to try to dismiss Jesus' standards and live by Liz Taylor's standards. Many in our culture do. Even some Christian churches have caved in. But we need to open ourselves to the help God gives men and women to remain faithful to the covenant with each other and with God in poverty or prosperity, in sickness or health, in good times or in worse times, all the days of their life. The fourth standard is to model our life on Christ the bridegroom's faithful and indissoluble love for the church's bride. The final standard Jesus mentions this Sunday is about our truthfulness. He tells us that we're not to take oaths because we should be so transparently truthful that we have no need to do so. Rather than behaving like people who to be believed have to say, I swear to God, or cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. Jesus wants our yes to be yes and our no to be no. We live in the midst of a culture that lies all the time, of politicians like George Santos, who totally invent a resume, of press spokesmen who spin rather than tell the truth, of deep fakes, of so many who don't keep their word in promises, of others who say only what they think others want to hear. Jesus says that everything other than total sincerity and honesty is from the devil, the father of lies. Jesus, who is truth incarnate, wants his followers to be distinguished as people who never lie, whose word is immediately believed because we would rather die than lie. Jesus calls us to a standard of full-time truthfulness and transparency and will help us courageously keep it. Next week, we'll take up the other two things that Jesus says are meant to distinguish us from others, which are perhaps the most challenging requirements of all: to respond to those who treat us in an evil way by turning the other cheek, and to love even our enemies and pray for our persecutors. But today, the church wants us to focus on these 5 ways we're meant to emulate Jesus and have our behavior surpass good pagans and religiously observant Jews. To love like Jesus, reconcile like Jesus, be pure like Jesus, be faithful like Jesus, and to be truthful like Jesus. Jesus came to fulfill the law of God the Father and wants to help us to fulfill it too. He wants this conversation on Sunday to be truly consequential. If we hear and heed what he's asking and respond to the help he gives, especially in the Holy Eucharist and Confession, he will assist us to become, through what he teaches in the Sermon on the Mount, more and more like him, more fully human and more divine. And that's the path of true happiness in this world and forever. God bless you.
Thank you, Father Landry. To hear more from Father Landry, check out his website at catholicpreaching.com, and you can also catch his writings at EWTN's own National Catholic Register. A big thank you to all our listeners for joining us. I hope that this show was helpful. I hope that it gave you more peace and more hope and more joy, and you go with our prayers.